This man, a so-called filial son, is about to kill his mom simply because her cooking doesn't taste good. While his mom is distracted watching TV, he sneaks into the kitchen, grabs a box of rat poison from the cabinet, and pours some into a glass. Then, he adds a scoop of coffee, pours in hot water, and stirs it. The rat poison is colorless, and it quickly blends into the coffee. The box reads, "Rapid rodent control." It seems this man can't wait any longer. Acting like nothing is amiss, he hands the coffee to his mom. She doesn't suspect a thing and takes a sip. Tasting sweetness, she asks,
"Did you put sugar in this?"
He says it tastes better with sugar, but his mom, blunt as ever, snap.
"Do it myself next time."
He doesn't seem upset at all, especially since his mom finishes the entire cup. She hates wasting anything. The corners of his mouth slowly curl up as he starts imagining a world without his mom, and how peaceful it would be. Just as he steps out of the room, the poison kicks in. His mom drops the cup, shattering it, and stumbles onto the couch. She tries to call 911, but her arms are already numb. She collapses to the floor, but her so-called dutiful son feels no guilt. After all, this isn't his first time killing someone. Old Joe is a serial killer. What's more shocking is that he works at the police station. Old Joe disguises himself as a janitor, enters and leaves conference rooms and offices freely, keeping a close eye on what the police do at all times to prevent himself from being exposed to the police. Old Joe is a low-key, hard-working employee. For 10 years, he hasn't been discovered. Every day, Old Joe carries a suitcase with him. Inside the suitcase, it is filled with killing tools. He purposely preys on women who live alone. For example, the woman in front of him, simply because she looked at Old Joe one more time in a grocery store. He imagines that she is seducing him. The way Old Joe pursues a relationship is by killing the other person, showing his possessiveness. He also has a nationally known nickname, the Cutter. Every time Old Joe picks a target, he stuffs a leftover apple into the target's mouth. This is his signature for murder. Within 10 years, the police recorded 6 killings, but in reality, he killed a total of 7 people. The last one is hidden in a car trunk in a parking lot. The reason for his twisted behavior dates back to when Old Joe was little. He personally witnessed his father cheating on his mom with a man. As a result, his mom became irritable and constantly abused him. Every day, the meals she made were as hard as rocks. Not even flies would touch them. So, he often gave his mom roses with thorns. As long as his mom was pricked, he felt his anger release. Besides, he also smeared chicken grease in the bathtub. But the resentment that had built up over time finally broke out. He drugged his mom. Growing up in this environment, Old Joe inherited his mom's temper, and, influenced by his father's infidelity, once he falls in love with a certain woman, he kills the other person, because only by doing so will the other person never cheat on him. Old Joe, the killer, is ostensibly a janitor at the police station. When he is on a break, he randomly chooses a target on the road. As long as the person looks innocent, he starts a one-sided fantasy. When his fantasy enters the infatuation stage, he kills the other person. But there's an overweight cleaning girl at the police station, who makes him sandwiches every day to make him happy. But Old Joe thinks she is ugly, so he pretends to be a cold, handsome guy, and focuses on surveillance at the police station. One day, he passes by the window of a storage room, and hears of a murder. The victim is a woman, and the cause of death is strangulation. An apple was left at the scene. The sheriff thinks this crime was also committed by the Cutter. But Old Joe is furious, since this woman wasn't killed by him. Instead, the murderer wants to cover it up, and purposely frames him with that apple, to teach this copycat a lesson. While cleaning the conference room, he steals the victim's photos. Then, he returns home and carefully goes through the photos, hoping to find the copycat before the police do. However, he finds no clue. The next day, he wants to go to the victim's house to find clues, but the police get there before him. Old Joe finds nothing, and can only pause his actions. What happens next becomes Old Joe's lifelong torment. Today is the unluckiest day for killer Old Joe. He can't keep his balls in his pants. He goes to the supermarket to buy fish food, and the 2 little goldfish at home are his only friends. But today, he meets the woman of his dreams. She sees him struggling to choose, so she offers to help him pick a brand. Old Joe takes one look at her, and instantly falls deeply in love. His dream girl has a unique vision. She is drawn to Old Joe's hairline from 100 yards away, to show off his charm. Old Joe says he's a cop, and of course, his dream girl becomes more interested. What's even more ironic is, they both head home in the same direction, so they get on the same bus. But when it's time to get off, his dream girl says she's afraid to walk alone at night, and asks Old Joe to take her home. Old Joe picks up on the hint and immediately agrees. This must be divine intervention. After they get off the bus, thoughtful Old Joe puts his coat around her, then pulls out a pistol and slides it behind his waist, telling her it's a police gun. but in reality, it's just an early warning. If the dream girl ever finds out the truth, she would never dare to call for help. And shockingly, the dream girl doesn't suspect a thing. Killer Old Joe is about to be bullied by a weak girl. He and his dream girl walk down a deserted path. As they walk, she holds Old Joe's arm, like a pair of lovebirds. But the next second, his dream girl pulls out his gun, points it at him with a cold expression, and forces Old Joe to open his suitcase. Inside, she sees apples and knives. One thing becomes clear to her. She then forces Old Joe to strip off his pants and underwear, sits by an abandoned car, and handcuffs his hands behind his back. Old Joe is a little panicked, not knowing what his dream girl wants to do. But then he changes his mind and thinks, maybe his dream girl just wants to play something different. When he's about to enjoy it, his dream girl pulls out a dagger, straddles Old Joe, and makes a clean cut. She wipes the blood with her hand and puts it in her mouth. At this moment, Old Joe's dream girl looks more like a murderer than he does. She asks him if he is the cutter. Old Joe refuses to admit it, fearing that she might be some kind of justice agent, specializing in assassinating bad guys like him. Killer Old Joe is about to lose his balls. He sees the witch putting a gun in his mouth, and a dagger against his cock. Old Joe has no choice but to admit his identity. The next second, the witch taps his mouth, then takes out a pair of pliers and clamps down on Old Joe's cock, breaking it. The sound of pain is trapped in his throat, and Old Joe passes out from the pain. After sunset, a thief stealing a watch wakes him up. Old Joe wants to scream for help, but finds a piece of shit in his mouth. He sits up with difficulty, looks at the misery beneath him, and almost dies of shock. The witch has shockingly broken one of his balls by clamping it. But Old Joe is a killer, and his mental toughness is impressive. He adjusts his mindset quickly, comforts himself with the thought that he still has one ball left, and that with some addictive pills, reproduction won't be a problem. He struggles to stand up, puts on his pants, and holds up an abandoned car. One of Killer Old Joe's balls was just cut off. Every time he takes a step, it hurts. You can only see him bending down in pain, swearing he will kill the witch while picking up his things. And if he goes to the hospital like this, the police will definitely come after him. In a daze, he calls his admirer, the overweight girl, and asks her to come take care of him. When the overweight girl sees this, she nearly dies of shock. She immediately tries to call the police, but Old Joe rushes to stop her. The overweight girl has no idea what happened, but still does what he says, sewing up his broken ball. But she finds information about the cutter at Joe's house. When Old Joe wakes up, he realizes he's connected to a urinary drainage bag. The sense of panic fades away. He doesn't remember that the overweight girl was the one who fixed him, but he finds out that the drainage bag has the overweight girl's name on it, and the house has been cleaned, with the police documents also organized. Old Joe was so scared, he couldn't help but pee himself. This may mean that the overweight girl has figured out his real identity. So just in case, he has to kill her. One of Killer Old Joe's balls was just cut off. He takes out the urinary drainage bag and gathers the tools for his next crime. Bearing the pain in his ball, he's about to kill the overweight girl. But just then, there's a knock at the door. A warning goes off in Old Joe's head. Did the overweight girl already call the police? Old Joe doesn't dare to open the door. He's about to escape through the window. But as soon as he takes a step, the pain from his ball almost makes him scream. Old Joe clutches his injured ball, then looks at the door. Even if he escapes through the window, his ball will probably get broken again. And if that happens, what's the point of living? So, he opens the door quickly, but no one is there. Just a package on the floor. He opens it and finds his cell phone and crime tools inside. Old Joe realizes immediately that this was sent by the witch, to make him do her bidding or risk having his real identity exposed. But no matter what, the most important thing now is to kill the overweight girl. Old Joe grabs a toolbox and heads to the police station, clutching his ball. At the station, the officers tell him that the overweight girl didn't come to work. From the looks of the officers, the overweight girl hasn't exposed him. So, he shows up at the overweight girl's doorstep. Killer Old Joe is ostensibly a janitor at the police station. This time, he has come to kill someone. He hides a dagger on his body before knocking on the door. The overweight girl is a little flattered by his arrival and welcomes Old Joe into the house. While she isn't looking, Old Joe carefully pulls out the dagger, but the overweight girl suddenly turns around and asks Old Joe why he took the file from the police station. Old Joe hid the dagger behind him and calmly explained that his dream was to become a police officer too. So he had taken those files, hoping they would help the sheriff solve the case faster. The overweight girl, being naive, immediately thinks Old Joe is a nice guy. Old Joe then asks her if she will turn him in. The overweight girl sincerely replies, "Of course not. Perhaps it's because sincere people can touch others' hearts." Old Joe looks into her clean, innocent eyes and, surprisingly, gives up on his plan to kill her. But life has a way of showing us that even the strong have their weaknesses. And a villain's conscience is their Achilles heel. A dangerous seed has been planted. After Old Joe leaves the overweight girl's house, he gets a call from the witch. Shockingly, killer Old Joe is threatened. The witch tells him to find the copycat in 3 days, or else she'll cut off his other ball. Old Joe is a little scared, but for his own happiness, he decides to compromise. In the middle of the night, Old Joe arrives at the victim's mansion, armed with only a pair of nail clippers. He opens the sophisticated lock and slips inside. As he makes his way through the mansion, he notices that many valuables are still in place. Then, Old Joe enters the bedroom, opens a bottle of beer, and takes a sip. He imagines for a moment that he is the owner of the mansion. Afterward, he places the beer on the nightstand, takes out some pictures, and arranges them one by one. He studies them for a while but can't find any clues. Just as Old Joe is about to leave, he suddenly notices something. The pen in the picture and the pen found at the crime scene look different. Based on another clue from the picture, the victim had been playing crossword puzzles before she was killed. She would have definitely tried to stab the killer with the pen but didn't succeed. Killer Old Joe is very observant. He sees scratch marks on the wall. Maybe they were left after the killer took the pen and threw it out. Now, the two pens are different, and the only person who had the chance to switch the pens could be the police officer who investigated the scene. In other words, the copycat is a police officer. The purpose of switching the pens is that one has the copycat's fingerprints on it. Then, who on earth is this police officer in sheep's clothing? While Old Joe is thinking, there's a noise at the door. He rushes to grab his toolbox and hides behind the bathroom door. It turns out the sheriff came here without his men. Such strange behavior. It really looks like a criminal trying to cover up evidence after committing a crime. But at that moment, the sheriff notices the beer Old Joe just took a sip of. He's instantly alert, and he subconsciously looks toward the bathroom. Then he comes over and turns the light on. Old Joe holds the dagger and holds his breath in anxiety. If the sheriff takes one more step forward, Old Joe's gonna kill him. He doesn't want the witch to cut off his ball. But then, a phone rings, and the sheriff gets called back to the station. Old Joe, lucky as hell, gets away. He watches the sheriff leave and a plan forms in his head. He's gonna force the copycat to show himself. So, he figures he'll pay him back. He plans to kill someone the same way the copycat did, hoping it'll make him show up. The flower seller's cute. She's someone Old Joe can't help but notice on his way to work. He's already got a thing for her. It's gotten to the point where he's obsessed. So, he sneaks into her place and finds her bedroom like he knew exactly where it was. Seems like he's been here before. He hears water running from the bathroom and grins, his mouth twitching. He finishes the beer he had earlier, then gets back to his usual routine. The thing that killer Old Joe likes to do the most is to eat an apple before killing someone. He eats an apple and holds a dagger in his hand. He waits for the moment the door opens silently. Turns out next second, the person who opens the door isn't a young beauty. Instead, it's a big guy with a tattoo on his arm. He rushes to throw the bottle over, limps out, while holding his ball and bearing the pain on the way. Turns out he coincidentally meets police on their way out. Old Joe rushes to hide behind a car. After the man with tattoo comes out, he cannot see where Old Joe is, so immediately reports to the police that he saw the cutter. The police surround the area right away. Old Joe is surrounded by the police because his ball's pain slows him down. Turns out the witch shows up at this moment and lets Old Joe hide in the trunk. He escapes again, and the man with tattoo on his arm even found out Old Joe's real identity, but didn't see Old Joe's face clearly. However, the police gained important news. Next day Old Joe goes to work, and hears from Vent that the police found out. The cutter brings a suitcase with him. Old Joe is on the verge of something big, immediately climbs down, and puts the suitcase in garbage bag. He is about to destroy the evidence, but he changes his mind. If he trashes the suitcase, once it is found, the police will suspect that there is an insider at the police station. So he gives up, and comes up with a good idea. Since the copycat replicates him, then he will turn the copycat into the real cutter. And every time the police go out, they will fill out a police list. Once the list of police officers who responded the night the victim was killed is found, the copycat will be pinpointed fast. Old Joe, the killer, is ostensibly a janitor at the police station. He brings a cup of coffee, spits in it, then knocks on the door and passes it to the sheriff. Next, he takes advantage of the opportunity and locks his eyes on the list. At that moment, another female officer comes in, saying a new clue has been found. So the sheriff is called off. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Old Joe grabs the list, heads to the print room to make a copy. but coincidentally, there's a paper jam in the printer. Then, in another coincidence, the overweight girl sees this, and she comes in since she wants to help. Old Joe couldn't be more panicked, so he immediately tells her to get out. The overweight girl runs out, crying. At this moment, another officer comes over and asks if he can help, and Old Joe, in this case, doesn't dare to get mad. All he can do is to put a smile on his face and say everything's fine. After the officer is gone, a copy of the list is made. Old Joe puts the original list back. This is the third time he's gotten away without a scratch. After getting the list, he starts going through it, one by one. Killer Old Joe's analytical skills are as sharp as Sherlock Holmes. The first suspect is a photographer. If he were the copycat, he definitely wouldn't have taken a picture of that pen. It would expose him. It cannot be the overweight police officer either. Since that guy has to catch his breath for 5 minutes after walking up the stairs, he definitely doesn't have the energy to commit a crime. It definitely can't be the skinny cop, since his arm was injured before the crime happened. After crossing out these options one by one, only 3 suspects remain: the sheriff, David, and Michael. The sheriff is too sharp and not easy to deal with. So Old Joe decides to start with David first, to prevent the overweight girl from calling the police. He apologizes to her before putting his plan into action. Then, he follows David all the way to his home. Once again, he picks the lock using nail clippers. He is about to launch a surprise attack, but to his shock, he finds out David's gay. This scene reminds him of his father, bringing back painful childhood memories. Old Joe leaves in disgrace, but one thing is certain: David is not the suspect, because the victim was female and nothing valuable was stolen from her home. It is most likely a love affair. So far, 3 days have passed. The witch makes another appearance. One of Killer Old Joe's balls was cut off by the witch, so she is the one Old Joe is most afraid of. After realizing that Old Joe hasn't made any progress, she pulls out a pistol and gives Old Joe 24 hours. Otherwise, she will definitely make Old Joe a eunuch. Old Joe is badly pissed off, but to keep his other ball, he decides to use the same trick again, but he can't target the flower seller anymore, since no one knows if the police would set up a trap. So, he finds a hooker instead, and brings her to the victim's home. The woman, being very open-minded, she takes off her coat and shows the gear she's wearing underneath. She kneels in front of Old Joe, about to offer her services. But the next second, Old Joe opens a suitcase. The woman sees the apple and freaks out, rushing to grab her pepper spray. But Old Joe breaks her wrist, forces her to the ground, and chokes her hard. In less than 2 minutes, she dies. Then Old Joe leaves behind a half-eaten apple, puts the woman in the car, lights a fire and shifts the blame to the copycat. Soon, there is a clue. Killer Old Joe investigates information at the police station every day. When he's on duty, he sees the hooker's friend Ava coming to report the incident and, shockingly, warmly greeting the sheriff. Old Joe has a suspicion, so after he's off duty at night, he goes back to that street. He takes Ava, but what Old Joe doesn't know is that someone has been watching him. The two of them go to a small hotel, and Ava is also enthusiastic and starts with a tongue kiss. Old Joe takes out some cash and asks Ava if she served the sheriff. Ava denies it, but for the money, she tells Old Joe that she only served one cop, and that person liked to play tricks, always strangled her neck with a rope. A white man, black hair, and blue eyes. Old Joe instantly realizes that this cop who likes to strangle with a rope is the copycat. After this talk, Ava leaves happily, but Old Joe doesn't want to let her go. After all, as long as money is offered, Ava can rat out anyone. So Old Joe makes a move on Ava and is about to put her in the trunk. Killer Old Joe opens the trunk and is shocked to see a body. It turns out to be the guy who secretly filmed him, and his real identity is a cop. Just then, the witch shows up, and Old Joe immediately realizes she's the one who helped him out of this mess. But instead of feeling grateful, he's annoyed. Now he has 2 bodies to deal with and no chance of getting any sleep tonight. Old Joe starts driving to the countryside to bury the bodies, but the car runs out of gas halfway because it's overloaded. He struggles to push the car to a gas station, and buys $50 worth of gas. While he's pumping, he unexpectedly runs into his neighbor, Jimmy, who greets him warmly. Just then, a police car pulls in, and Old Joe panics. Killer Old Joe encounters the police, but the car's gas tank hasn't been filled. The police in the car are always staring at his side. Old Joe lowers his head, staring at the gas meter the whole time. Finally, the gas tank is full. But then, next-door neighbor Jimmy spots blood on the trunk door. Old Joe rushes to clean it up, and says it was accidentally left there after he bought some pork. Jimmy doesn't question it. Old Joe rushes to get in the car and drive away. In this case, he can't drive to the countryside to bury the bodies, since the police already saw him. So, just to be safe, he drives back and parks under his building. He grabs a shovel and some alcohol, planning to bury the bodies somewhere close to his house. But when he gets downstairs, he's shocked to find the car is gone. Old Joe has no idea who took it, but he instinctively thinks the police have found the bodies. So, he doesn't dare to stay home, grabs his bedroll and takes his little goldfish, heading to an abandoned rooftop to sleep. After dawn, the witch calls him, and says she took care of the bodies. The reason for doing this was to make Old Joe nervous, so he would find the copycat faster. Old Joe thinks there's something wrong with her brain, curses "fuck" in his mind, but still tells the witch the clues he's found recently. The witch disguises herself as a cop, goes to the hotel where Ava always checks in, takes out a picture showing Ava and those 3 cops, and pries open the mouth of the boss's wife with a lot of money. She's shocked to find out that the police officer who checked in with Ava is the unassuming Michael. The witch tells Old Joe the result. So Old Joe starts stalking Michael, wants to find out about his habits, so he can find a chance to sneak into his home to get evidence of his crimes. Old Joe sees that Michael runs in the morning after 6 a.m. He waits for an hour, but Michael still hasn't come back. But the next second, Michael shockingly shows up behind him. Anyone who works as a police officer is naturally sensitive. Michael grabs Old Joe's collar and presses him hard against the wall, asking why Old Joe is stalking him. Old Joe's mind works fast. He says he's very lonely at the police station, that everyone looks down on him and doesn't want to be his friend. Michael seems very kind to him, so he has been stalking him, wanting to find a chance to get to know Michael. This reason sounds a little gross. Michael thinks he wants to be his homosexual partner, so he kicks him once, saying,
"I'm not your friend."
Well, Old Joe's intentions are misunderstood again. Old Joe feels anger rising in his mind. It seems like evidence can't be found, so he decides to go through with the plan. One of Killer Old Joe's balls was cut off, but he still has the ability of a killer. He puts a hat on and comes to the hotel where Michael stays. He sees a janitor enter a room to clean. He sneaks into the room with a dagger, but the janitor is listening to music and doesn't notice Old Joe at all. He directly walks over, covers her mouth with one hand, and chokes her neck from behind with the other. He rips her headphones off, warns her not to scream if she doesn't want to die. The janitor nods in fear, and then Old Joe frees her, ties her hands and feet from behind, and ties them together. He puts the headphones back, then takes the universal card away. He comes to Michael's room, takes out his knife, and puts it on the counter. Then, he puts the knife that has Michael's fingerprints on it in a bucket. Next, he comes to the hotel with the witch, kills the boss's wife, smears the knife with the blood of the boss's wife, and throws it in the trash can. Killer Old Joe goes to work at the police station as a janitor. No one suspects his true identity. Taking advantage of the fact that the police are in a meeting, he sneaks into the archives, jots down Michael's phone number, and sends him a blackmail message. "I know you killed someone. Text me back in 5 minutes, or I'll call the cops." When Michael sees the message, he furrows his brow. Normally, if Michael weren't the killer, he'd definitely show the message to everyone, but now, he stays quiet, looking guilty. But Michael's a cop, and he quickly figures out it's a blackmail attempt. He connects it to Old Joe's earlier stalking, and heads straight to Old Joe. Angrily, he searches through Old Joe's phone, hoping to find evidence of the blackmail, but comes up empty-handed. Michael doesn't buy this, so he calls Old Joe right away, but no phone rings, because just a moment earlier, Old Joe had tossed his phone into a bucket. When Michael was closing the door, seeing that nothing's happening, Michael lowers his guard and leaves. Old Joe comes home. "What should I do if my phone gets wet?" Killer Old Joe has an idea. He puts the phone in a jar of rice. After the water is fully drained, he decides to blackmail again, because a bad guy never gives up. So, he goes to the victim's mansion again, sends the blackmail text message once more, and demands Michael to put $1 million in cash here in 30 minutes, or he'll call the police and expose the evidence of his crime. Michael gets the threat and has no choice but to show up. Old Joe grabs a pan, and when Michael isn't looking, rushes over and knocks him out. Then, he's about to take the money and run, but when he opens the bag, it's full of killing tools, with no money in sight. Old Joe gets mad again. He's ready to finish Michael off, but suddenly, Michael wakes up. The two start wrestling on the ground. Michael bites him hard, then rolls over and locks his neck, pins Old Joe to the ground, and chokes him with all his strength. Old Joe is about to die, but at the crucial moment, he touches a cup. One of Killer Old Joe's balls was cut off, so his fighting ability was cut in half. He can't take on the corrupt cops, so he knocks out the cop with a cup. After Michael wakes up again, he finds he's tied to a chair. Then, Old Joe brings in a parking ticket, asks him to hold it. Michael doesn't understand, but since he's in a vulnerable position, he does what he's told. Then, Old Joe goes back to the police station, puts the parking ticket into Michael's locker, then calls the sheriff anonymously, saying the copycat's murder weapon is in a nearby trash can. Old Joe's purpose is to get money. He also wants to frame Michael for the cutter's crimes, so he can clear his own name. With the police's sharp instincts, they find the knife, run a fingerprint match, and suspect Michael. Then they open the locker, find the parking ticket, and based on its address, they track down the seventh person Old Joe killed. In the end, Michael becomes the cutter. The killer, Old Joe, calls the witch, uses the same brutal method as before, and forces Michael to confess his intent to commit the crime. Turns out, he was the victim's cheating partner. The victim had been experiencing domestic violence for years, and she was desperate to vent her frustration. At a cocktail party, Michael saw how vulnerable she was, and under the influence of alcohol, the two of them slept together. But after she sobered up, the victim was afraid her husband might find out, so she shockingly decided to kill Michael. But in the end, Michael killed her. Afterward, Michael was afraid his career would be ruined, so he replaced the pen with an apple, wanted to pass the buck to Old Joe. But what Michael doesn't realize is, the witch has nothing to do with it. So why did she get involved? The witch says her motive was, turns out, her sister was killed by the corrupt cops, so whenever the cops do something wrong, she transfers her hate onto them, and kills them. What happens next is the witch kills Michael with a dagger. Then the two of them burn the mansion, and bury Michael in the countryside. Old Joe thinks he's the perfect criminal, leaving no clues behind. But what he doesn't know is, killer Old Joe eats an apple every time before he kills someone. The police find the overweight girl's fingerprints on that parking ticket. It turns out that, over the past few days, Old Joe had been busy passing the buck to Michael. He had been applying for days off and was absent from work. The overweight girl was concerned about him, so she came to his home to look for him but didn't find him. Since she was already there, the overweight girl decided to tidy up the house and ended up finding the parking ticket. The sheriff saw the panic on her face and believed she wasn't involved in the crime. Under further questioning, the overweight girl had no choice but to tell the truth. Old Joe does bad things with the witch and experiences a joy he had never felt before. They sympathized with each other and surprisingly became a couple. It's a good thing he wasn't fully castrated, otherwise, he wouldn't have had a happy life. When he was enjoying happiness, the overweight girl suddenly came to the door. One of killer Old Joe's balls was cut off by the witch, and surprisingly, the two of them became a pair of lovers. The overweight girl hopes Old Joe will turn himself in. Old Joe is instantly shocked and has no idea where he messed up. Before he can react, the police arrive. Old Joe immediately opens the suitcase and puts a gun to the overweight girl's head, threatening the police to let him go. However, the SWAT team has surrounded him. Even though he has a hostage, the SWAT team can still take him down. The overweight girl is the only one who treats him seriously in this world. Thinks about this, his mind softens. He pushes the overweight girl away, and puts the gun to his neck. Even though he's been found, he is unwilling to leave his fate in someone else's hands. Then, the next second, bang. Old Joe takes the shot, but luckily, the overweight girl saves him. One of Old Joe's eyes is injured, but the overweight girl survives as well. The sheriff walks up to the ambulance and tells Old Joe, "I never thought it would be you." Old Joe only responds by raising his middle finger, refusing to give in. What follows closely is the ambulance driving to the prison. And throughout this whole process, the witch didn't do anything.
I'm coming for you, Joe.
This film is called Dark City, The Cleaner. You're recommended to watch the original movie. If you like the commentary, please like and subscribe.